Hi, everybody. I'm Katherine Prince. I work as Vice President of Strategic Foresight at KnowledgeWorks, where I've had the pleasure of exploring the future of learning for about 14 years now. So excited to be looking at what we can draw from this moment to think ahead as our circumstances have changed.
And work in the Brady Bunch, Maria.
Hi, my name is Maria Romero. I am originally from Venezuela. I've been in the United States since 2015 and working as a futurist pretty much since then. I am the Senior Manager of Strategic Foresight in KnowledgeWorks and happy to be here.
Hi, everyone. I am Katie King. I'm the Director of Strategic Foresight Engagement at KnowledgeWorks. Have been working with the organization for since about 2015, was a classroom teacher before that, and I'm looking forward to diving in. And just one other logistical thing, we'll have the chat open. Please share your thoughts and insights there. The Q&A box will be where we'll be monitoring a little more closely to see if there are questions that I can then pose to the group. So if you have something you want us to actually possibly discuss, and like Jason said, we'll get to as many of those as we can, put it in the Q&A box. Otherwise, just thoughts or things you want us to take a look at afterwards, feel free to use the chat.
Cool. And my name is Jason Swanson. I'm the Director of Strategic Foresight here at KnowledgeWorks. I'm based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I've been with KnowledgeWorks going on 6 years this summer. And I'll also be playing the role as a facilitator. So we put our heads together and started to think of some bigger questions that we might want to tackle from each one of our perspectives. So our hope is to go through those and then leave about 15-ish or so minutes for Q&A at the end. So one of the first questions that I got when the coronavirus really started to take hold was actually from my parents, my mother in particular. And she was just really curious. She said, okay, I don't always understand what you do, to be fair, but you are all always looking at the future. And like, did you see this coming? You know, Katherine, I'm gonna look to you to kind of kick this off and then we can all chime in.
I think we did and we didn't see it coming. You know, if I look back to some of the work we were doing back in 2010, 2011, we were certainly writing personas and scenarios that alluded to these kinds of circumstances and the kind of broad scale disruption that COVID-19 has brought. And yet at the same time, it's one thing to know that those kinds of things are possible, and it's another thing to kind of remember day to day that it's coming. So I think we've been really aware that systems shocks were a distinct possibility, that our systems were brittle and needed to be more resilient. You know, we even wrote a scenario about a young learner whose parents had died in a pandemic. So, you know, we kind of knew, but when it becomes real, I think we all were still taken by surprise when it hit.
Yeah, for sure. Maria, Katie?
Yeah. To me, it's the same. It's like yes and no. Like we don't have like explicitly said anywhere, you know, this is going to happen, because we are not trying to make predictions. That's not really what we do. So it was always like a possibility, and it was kind of on the radar. And not only this, but more as Katherine was saying, like a system shock that could take different, like it could be a pandemic, but it could also be, for example, a natural disaster. It would still have a similar effect because it interrupts like our normalcy as we understand it. So that's important to mention, but also I like this notion that I read about desensitized futures. Like maybe, you know, after like reading about it so much or like considering it so much, people just think like, oh yeah, you've told me this so many times and it has not happened. So it probably, you know, you were wrong. So that's it. So that's a possibility. And also, I wonder if it is, you know, our responsibility as futurists to communicate the urgency of the situation better, so people could take it seriously and not disregard it as something that it's like impossible or less likely.
For sure. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Is I heard a really famous futurist, Peter Schwartz, say that, you know, there are countless forecasts out there about disruptive events, climate change, pandemics, you name it. And, you know, yes, desensitized futures. We get sick of hearing it. We did, you know, the forecast retrospective, right? And we were talking about large-scale system shocks. All futures work considers inbound change and really a few big flavors for which future events would be one, you know, discontinuous big shocking events. So I think that, you know, just by virtue of the work we talk about these shocks, I do wonder, you know, whether this is a desensitized future. And I also wonder about what vehicles for communication we might consider going forward to really, you know, better communicate these things. Foresight's an interesting thing. We lead with, we can't predict any of this, but yet, you know, it's our job to make you spend time and resources to prepare for something that might not ever occur. So yeah, did we see it? I think kind of is good. Katie, you know, is there anything that you'd care to weigh in for around this?
Yeah, I sort of have the unique experience that my parents both have a background in foresight. So our conversation certainly was different about it. And I think one of the things that that I have heard my dad say a lot that I think really applies is that we do foresight to prepare to be surprised. And that it's not so much that then eliminates the surprise entirely, or it makes us 100% ready to handle it when it comes, but that we've done enough preparation that we know those disruptions are coming, and that we can be resilient enough to hopefully withstand them as best we can. And I think offering all of ourselves some grace in that there's no way to be entirely prepared for a really big disruption. So understanding that and using that as information moving forward.
That's terrific. Prepare to be surprised. I really like that. So in keeping with that theme of preparing to be surprised, right? Obviously, the current moment in time is riddled with critical uncertainties. So I'm curious to hear from my team, you know, what we view those big critical uncertainties for learning. What might they be right now because of COVID-19?
I mean, one of them for me is, where are learners going to be? And that's a real near-term question. I mean, some people are still wondering whether their summer care is going to be open or not. And then it's, you know, question for the fall and beyond. And if they're not in school, you know, 5 days a week, or if they're rolling closures, then what kinds of infrastructure do we need to consider putting in place to help learners be safe, to help parents be able to work effectively, and make sure that learners have the other kinds of supports that they need?
Yeah, somewhat related to that, to me, it's like the assessment, how to, you know, after we've gone through this period where learners are just like getting whatever they can, but it's not really uniform by any means. Like, how are we gonna assess those differences and then try to get them to where they need to be in a shorter amount of time to try to almost like catch up? But even like a bigger question is like, is that the objective? Like, is that what should we aim to do with our education system as a whole? Or do we need to worry about other priorities before even getting to assessment? And also on that like bigger kind of systemic question, it's like, yes, there are a lot of questions about the learners, but there's also even more questions to me about the other adults involved in the learners' lives, like just to start the teachers and like how they can deal with like going back to normal, if we can call it that even, and like how to do it, you know, would they be willing to do it? Like, what about the higher risk population and the relationships that they have with like their families and all that? How would they like manage those? Like, we've seen that you know, this crisis have put a toll in how first responders relate to their families, because they need to keep some distance. Like, is that going to be what we do with teachers as well if they go back and they need to interact with a lot of like a larger group of kids? Or, you know, and also because they spend a lot of time together, not only like they don't even need to be larger groups of kids to be at risk. So
yeah, I think my uncertainty, my biggest one right now is less about the external environment, which there are a lot of uncertainties there, but more about us and how we are going to respond and how willing we're going to be to really face what we're experiencing and let it change us. I think, my question is, are we going to let history be, and what has always been, be informative of our path forward, but not necessarily be our goal? I think that we're seeing people rise to the occasion of this moment in some really amazing ways. Continuing to do that over time, it's going to be really challenging. And are we willing to have the hard conversations where we say, we know what we need to do for kids and for teachers, but we don't know how to do it. And it may be unpopular, and it may be entirely different than what we've ever done before. And are we willing to have that conversation and make those attempts? Or are we, in other cases, willing to say we don't know what to do? But in either case, not necessarily be willing to go the path of least resistance, which I understand the appeal and have to fight that urge myself every day in this situation. So it's really, how long are we willing to stick with the difficult decisions and difficult conversations we have to have in order to meet the needs of kids and communities and of our society.
Yeah, those are the thoughts that are really keeping me up at night, Katie. You know, it's a very understandable and very human reaction to want to go back to life as we know it, even if that, you know, that past paradigm is totally flawed. So the critical uncertainty for me is, can we deepen, spread, and sustain the amazing work that, to a point that it's almost transformational for the system? So what's our appetite for change while everything else is changing? I saw a comment pop up that it's time for an education revolution. And yes, it's long been that time, right? So is this that moment to kind of push forward? So it's can we overcome, to me, that very human want to go back to how things were, even if that's no longer an option for us?
And one question, Jason, that came up in the Q&A that's sort of related to that appetite for change. Claire asked whether we are seeing more interest in that conversation and whether we're seeing it in any way the beginning of an appetite to engage in radical system redesign. So I'd just be curious from your perspectives whether you all are hearing or seeing that, or what you're, and it may be too early to really know where people are, but based on what the conversations you've been having.
Yeah, so most of my conversations have been local. But, you know, I've been hearing a lot of positive language from people that play very deeply within the system. So colleagues within the Pennsylvania Department of Education have used the T word a lot, right? So this is the time to transform learning. So we've had to roll out, you know, innovative initiatives around distance learning, but can we begin to drive deeper change? Certainly Western Pennsylvania, with the stewardship of the Remake Learning Network and its amazing network members, are acting, you know, very, very innovatively, very, very collaboratively to meet the demands that COVID-19 has placed on our learning communities. But at the same time, they're asking how sort of those innovations can sow the seeds for that visionary future. So are they creating pockets of the future now, and can they move to it? And this has ranged from everything from things like innovative professional learning networks to even thinking about resource allocation radically differently. So, what does it look like to truly share resources across district lines, including teaching? Might we see a regional model for teaching? So I'm really encouraged and pleased by what I've heard. And, really with the leadership that I've seen with people that are doing great things and are kind of fearlessly charging ahead right now.
Yeah, I've mentioned before that I think that this crisis has accelerated conversations that we thought that they would happen in the next 10 years or so, but now they're all kind of happening almost like at the same time, and we are forced into having these difficult conversations, kind of to your point, Katie, because it has made kind of those flaws in the system much more obvious, and we see the inequities more now than ever before. It just made it clear. And then on the other hand, because of the situation that we're in one of the blog posts that we recently posted on our Futures Thinking Now series, I talked about the Futures Triangle, which is a tool to kind of understand how drivers of change kind of can be categorized between past, present, and the future. And the past is understood as the way of history. And in the situation that we're in, it's really because there's this urgency to respond to what's going on now. There's the weight of history is lighter. So we have this opportunity to take this moment and not only respond to the present, but also push ourselves towards a future vision that we already have, or that we might need to craft at this moment to then respond to the longer term, not only to the short term.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm too hearing people talk about and reading people talk about this as a generational opportunity to rethink, re-envision, and restructure how we want learning to take place. I think one of the critical uncertainties I'm feeling is, will we leap to that transformation, and will we seize that moment, or will we reverberate back, not even to how it was, but accept some kind of basic minimum education, at least for emergency times. I know my daughter's not having a full version of school. There are lots of comments in the chat box about the importance of addressing trauma of this moment, other traumas, social emotional learning over academics, and having a community. I think for too many learners, it's just the bare bone, one size fits all academics right now. And I'm worried that some stripped down version of that might become at least an emergency norm.
And I think one of the kind of questions about that of sort of how we might proceed if we do hope to see some transformation. And I saw a comment about this in the chat from Nicholas of how do we expand who gets to be a part of that discussion. I think if we have the same power structures and the same decision-making processes that we have always had, that we aren't going to get there. And I think Katherine just outlined something of what her daughter is experiencing. Families are experiencing, there's some commonality, but there's also so much variation in what's happening. And to assume that any one of us can capture that ourselves and then know what we need to do moving forward that will serve every learner and family, I think that's just a misguided notion. So how do we change our processes, the processes by which we pursue transformation? Mm-hmm. I think is going to be critical for if we actually have any chance of getting there.
So, we can add this to our list of critical uncertainties too, is how do we invite others to come with us in co-creating this future space that we want to move into, right? Because there is, a certain amount of preaching to the choir with a lot of these conversations that are happening about innovation and transformation. It's usually the same folks that show up. So how do we invite those what we would consider unusual suspects as voices that aren't often heard, and really bring them into this watershed moment and say your voices are not only valuable, they're critical to this, right? And that, this is, we like to cast education as the intellectual infrastructure of our society. So by rights, we all own it, and we should have a say in what it looks like. So I think that that's going to be one of the most important considerations and strategies to think through in all of this. So, we talked a little bit about uncertainties. One of the things that I'm really curious to hear from the three of you is, what are some possible scenarios that we might see either on the other side of COVID, right? So, God willing, we've got a vaccine in the next couple of years, or even through, as we emerge out of this, what might some scenarios be? For me, I go back to two, and I realize the future is not a binary place. But we have the more transformative scenario where we say, okay, to come out of this, we need to build the future on the shoulders of partnership, and that we can create systems that surround the learner, that can take all the best practices that we're seeing now in response to COVID and carry them through into the future. My worry, though, is we might see a different scenario appear where, because it's more cost effective to engage in more of an ed tech mediated environment, that we actually end up with a digital race to the bottom, and that it's seen as being transformational, but it's really innovating within a very narrow framework.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think there was some questions in the Q&A about distance learning and the challenges that schools and students and families have faced with it. And your point makes me think, is that the problem that we're going to try to solve in a narrow way? How do we make distance learning better, which is something that we should address? Or are we going to take a more kind of holistic view of it? Because in that, we could very easily focus narrowly on what didn't work in our response this time, and try and improve upon that, which I think could potentially get us to that scenario you're talking about, Jason. Or we could expand what fundamentally hasn't been working. Where did that show up in this place, in this situation? And what does that tell us bigger picture about what we need to work on?
Well, to what you were saying, Katie, about how different people are being impacted differently. And, this is a crisis that it's varying by state, by cities. Rural versus urban areas have different responses and have been impacted differently. So I think it's just going to be kind of a patchwork of scenarios, if even, because different communities and learning communities are going to respond to either more narrow challenges, or maybe some of them are going to recognize that this is a unique opportunity to kind of, change the system as a whole, and then they're going to look for those partnerships. So instead of looking at it as from the binary point of view, it's more just that's opening a spectrum. Mm-hmm. And then each learning community can fall in that spectrum. And so how do we connect those different scenarios? How do they, how these different learning communities are going to interact with each other? It could be another scenario by itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead, Catherine.
I was going to say, I think that there's a plausible scenario in which we would see competency-based learning take much greater hold than it has to date, even though there has been a growing movement toward it. I think we're realizing that we need to have broader and more effective ways of understanding what children have mastered, and not just what they've sat in a seat somewhere, whether it's in person or online doing. So I feel like that could be a lever of change that would both help address some immediate needs while also setting up the system to have broader possibilities for learners across a variety of pedagogies. And I feel like the appetite for that is growing in this moment.
I would agree. And I think that the economic reality that is emerging in all of this is going to be one of frankly, severe austerity. So in Pittsburgh, we forecasted a $150 million deficit this year. Pennsylvania as a whole, $2.2 billion just in year one. So I'm thinking that this might be an accelerator in terms of how we structure learning. So because of the dire need for resource sharing, this might begin to really push deep cross-sector partnerships, and it's going to have to, that fundamentally put the learner at the center. So, we talked about this previously in a strategy guide publication, but that need to really truly create systemic interdependencies this crisis is pushing that to the forefront. And whether we consider it a network, an ed cluster, an ecosystem, I think that cross-boundary sharing isn't going to be something that's just desirable. It's going to be critical. So I think that it's plausible that we might expect to see different structures for learning, insofar as organizing principles as well.
One other, I kind of put my teacher hat on when I was thinking of this, but I think it could have major implications when we think about sort of student mindset when they come back to school in whatever form it looks like, and whenever that may occur. And I anticipate that we would just see this wide range of levels of engagement and buy-in. There are some students who are really going to crave what they had before and crave some of those traditional systems and structures and processes, and others who are going to say, wait a second, we haven't been doing this for however long, and questioning things in a different way. And so what does that look like on a larger scale? And how do we hear that and accept the truth of what they're saying? How do we manage that as a system? How do we use that as an opportunity to get them more engaged and involved in what learning should look like? So that's sort of I think a scenario that every educator is going to need to deal with on a small scale, but gives us an opportunity to think about things on a larger scale as well.
Interesting. Cool. So futures work at its best, right, challenges us to question assumptions. And so, as we think through, the assumptions that we hold about how learning could or should operate, what assumptions might we all benefit from challenging right now?
I think one is that learning takes place in and must be mediated by a place we call school. I mean, obviously learning takes place in much broader ways. The way we've systematized it makes it hard to link up the learning that's taking place elsewhere with the learning that's formally credited and acknowledged by schools and other learning communities. And I think there's both enormous opportunity as we're considering new system designs, but it's also, and something I've personally been excited about over the years, but it's also in some ways possibly harder to think about a broader learning landscape or a broader learning ecosystem when a lot of the places we could go to engage in those kinds of experiences are also closed. We're not sure how many people we can be around anytime soon and be safe. So, again, there are digital options around all of that, but complicating consideration.
I think for me, one assumption that I think a lot of people are probably challenging, but that's really front of mind for me, is the assumption that we can just kind of scale up or do more of our approach to differentiated instruction, essentially, knowing that students are going to be coming back to school in whatever that form that looks like. With everyone knows it's going to be a wide range of experiences that they've had that we don't know anything about, both learning experiences and emotional experiences that we need to help them work through. And I just think we really need to examine the assumption that we may even have the structures in place to do that. I just don't think, when reflecting on my time as a teacher and how difficult it is to differentiate for the wide range of student experiences that were already present, and just thinking that we can do a little bit more of that and we're going to be able to support kids in the way they need to be supported. That to me feels like something we really need to examine and say, what really do we need to do to make sure that we're supporting kids authentically and thoroughly, and not necessarily assuming that the structures we have in place to do that before are going to serve that.
Yeah, to me, the kind of building on top of what Katherine was saying, it's not only, you know, that education needs to, or learning needs to be mediated by school, but also that there's no scheduled time for learning, that it can happen pretty much at any time. And now that we are like blurring the times on our schedule, and it's like, you know, parents that are working and caring for children and maybe other family members at the same time, it's not like you do, you know, an hour of this and an hour of that. It's just like more complicated than that. So that is one assumption that I think it's going to be challenged, and people are experiencing themselves, so it's going to be easy to talk about it from like a personal anecdotal perspective. And then another one is that we were kind of talking about it earlier, you know, it's this, what are the priorities for learning and education? Is it academic preparation? Is it going to be to provide a safe space for kids or children to develop and flourish? And also, what is the role of parents in all that, you know, because that's clearly going to change going forward. At least that is my opinion, my perspective. Since they now have been so involved in this process, like are they going to be ready to just let go once things change, or are they going to be really now empowered, and would they want to be even more involved going forward? So there are differences there that we could talk about.
So this is, I'm probably going to bungle how I express this, but I think right now the system is set up under the assumption that it is designed to serve learners and cultivate some measure of success. And I think that assumption is being directly challenged right now, in that those that were successful pre-COVID-19 were successful despite the way the system was arranged. They had parents that cared, they had access to resources and time so that you could augment your experiences within the education system and essentially get what you need. I think that one of the big changes from COVID is the world slowed down and got really transparent. And that assumption, or that major narrative, is being directly challenged now, because there are households whose parents aren't in a position to help you with online learning, that don't have the flexibility that maybe we have in terms of our schedules to help young people. So I think that major assumption has long been needed to be challenged, and that in this environment of increased transparency is being challenged very, very publicly. And then when we look at the system's response to prioritize learning continuity over anything else rather than health and well-being of students, caregivers, and teachers, that really says a lot, I think. So yeah.
One related question that came up in the Q&A is just, what question, is there a question that we all think people should be asking themselves right now, which I think is related to assumptions, but just putting that out, if there's any big questions that you think leaders right now can or should be asking.
Yeah.
There's obviously a lot.
I think the most important question is, and it's one we're really fond of asking, even before this disruption, is what do you want for the future of learning? Beyond sort of the mechanistic vision statement that your kids are going to be ready to work and be leaders in the future. But how might that system feel? How might it operate? And I think that because of this disruption, people need to go back and interrogate those visions. As they deploy massive amounts of resources, they look at innovation. If it is not of the quality expressed in that vision, then they're probably not the right answer. You know, the actions that we're taking in the present are going to shape that long-term future. So they need to be very, very critical, both about their aspirational sense of where they want to go and how the plans they're making now act to either design things to get there or to adapt in service of that vision.
I think one that I really think that people should be asking themselves right now, and related to the sensitized futures that I mentioned earlier, is that you know, what could be other real but invisible risks out there that we should be kind of talking about and preparing for. And then one that I've used myself, and it's like a big question to me as a futurist, it's just how can we help others create better futures for themselves, so they take a more active role in creating their own futures and not just, you know, waiting and having others telling what their future should look like.
I think a key question for me would also be how might we design our current responses and our future systems for equity. We've seen the system lay bare the inequities that we knew were there. And if we're not asking how we can move forward to reducing those inequities, then I think we're missing the moment and we're missing our responsibility to children.
My question is one that I think would serve us to ask for the immediate response and for the longer term of who do I need to be talking to right now? Who do I need to be in touch with? Which students, parents, community members do I need to be part of? Do I need to check in on, first of all, and make sure that they're okay? And second of all, who do I need to be a part of the conversation about what we want? I saw a comment in the chat as it passed by, who's part of that interrogation of the vision? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's just a question that we need to ask ourselves a lot more often now, is how do we get lots of different perspectives and lots of different experiences of what this moment has meant to people and what they've needed and what they continue to need, and let that really be a part of our plans moving forward.
Oh, for sure. And I have to plus one that comment. Absolutely. Because, you know, whose future are we talking about, right? So I think that that's a perfect segue. You want to move us to answering some of the questions in the Q&A?
Well, so a couple of questions are related around the sort of our preferences and what does transformation look like? So if we're talking about what could happen, what might happen, how we might respond, but we had someone say, you know, what do we mean by transformation, and what might our preferences for the future be? So I think that's one we can respond to.
Yeah, that's a big one too.
I think to me it sort of relates to that last comment that I made, that transformation in some ways looks like we engage and change differently. Mm-hmm. That we engage and change less from a hierarchical standpoint where students and families are something that experience the effects of our choices and instead are part of driving the choices and the change processes. And I think if we are able to change the way that we make change, then we will see outcomes that are different than what we've had. And so that to me is a way to transform the system in a way that then is resilient, because if you're continuing to engage people in the process of change, then you're continuing to adapt to changing needs, changing desires, and changing preferences.
To me, transformation really means like a systemic change, something that it's like fundamentally changing the metaphors, the myth that are sustaining the narratives that we are living and enacting today. And I mean, we are working on a publication that has an aspirational vision that I think reflects what we think would be a great vision for the future of learning. And you know, some of the elements there are aligned with what we're talking about here: equity, belonging, the need for focus on social and emotional learning, and also like the involvement with the community, and kind of what Katie was saying about a more inclusive decision-making process. So you know, to me, that is now like kind of that idea, like what I would like to see. I don't know if all that's gonna emerge from the current crisis that we're living, but it would be like I could see that this could again accelerate the conversations that we need to make that shift. So there is chance.
Mm-hmm. I think that this is a lot of yes and plus wanting each other. We certainly wrote a lot about, you know, our preferred futures, and you know, the publication that Maria referenced, I think gets to it at sort of that myth, metaphor, purpose level. You know, to me, from a structural standpoint, and we've long written about, you know, the idea of learning ecosystems, and I think that still, to me, remains an aspirational vision, is to have those structural interdependencies, to have a seamless flow of resources and experiences across a lot of different learning landscapes that really, frankly, prioritize a learner's needs, interests, and goals. So we can get away from really this notion of scaling up to really directly and very targetedly meet that learner's needs in service of their interests and goals, and really offer them a wide amount of experience to get there. And then reflecting, like, so we build that on top of those myth and metaphors and those narratives around, you know, education being a place rooted in love and, you know, designed to inspire critical consciousness, that that should liberate you, and you know, all of those great things, and not just boil it down to making you a better employee.
I would agree. Putting the whole person at the center of education, and you know, finding a variety of ways to meet their needs, you know, really tailored to each individual's circumstances.
One question that came through in the chat that I just think is particularly interesting, and I don't have an answer for it, so I'm going to throw it to you all first. But how might we define community in the future? You know, learning community or broader community, and we had some other questions around the roles of employers and the roles of kind of cultural spaces in the future. And though we can't know that, I wonder what your thoughts of what community might look like, how it might change on the other side of this.
So I've mentioned before how I think this is also changing the definition for local and what we consider local. And just because, you know, before this started, I thought that local was to go to downtown and spend my money on locally owned businesses, for example. But then a few weeks into being at home, local started to be more like getting eggs from my neighbors or getting red cabbage from my neighbors. So that was something that, you know, just like hit me one day when I was reflecting on the changes that we're experiencing. And I think that to some extent that it's going to happen with our definition of community, because you're going to think that you know, it's going to kind of close down on like who is like the closest to you. But funny enough, we've also become closer online to other people. Like during these times, I've been singing happy birthday with people that I haven't been singing happy birthday with for like decades or years, just because it's normal to have a happy birthday on Zoom or whatever video conference. So it's like you are kind of focusing down on the like physical community, but now we are blurring even more so the lines of online community, online support networks, and that takes shapes in like different aspects of life. So I think that it's what's interesting to me about the question on how we define community going forward.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I could add on top of that, Maria. I've had that same shared experience. I mentioned that at the beginning of this session, and that my online community is blown up in a way that, I am consistently talking to friends and loved ones from hours away that, and under normal circumstances, I just didn't talk to all that often, right? That even, the weird social norms that have bubbled up of wearing a mask in public have actually created almost tighter communal bonds, because now I'm forced to signal to you that I'm friendly, right? So waving, hey, how you doing? What are you up to? So it's kind of strengthened those connections, at least locally for me. So in a way, it's like, I don't see a drastic redefinition of community, only that it expands in ways that maybe were somewhat unexpected and surprising to me personally.
I think that community may seem more precious coming out of this, and that we may be more intentional about cultivating it, as the examples you both have been highlighting illustrate. I think we're both realizing through the pandemic just our biological interconnection, and through our isolation, I think it's underscoring the interdependence that we share. So with relationships being so critical to education in particular, I think we'll find the ways to cultivate those, even if they can't be in person. And we may place greater primacy on them in the system and generally than we did previously.
I think, not to end on a negative note, but I do think that we do need to also pay attention to the ways that it can, sort of what we're experiencing can create more division. In California here, we have such a wide variety of different counties and communities and how they're experiencing the pandemic. And it has the potential to harden some boundaries, to make people think different things about someone who lives in this community versus that community, and how safe a place is or not, whether people feel burdened upon because they're having to follow rules that really don't feel like they apply to my community. So I think we need to be attentive to how some of those divisions and polarizations that we have a very strong foundation of, unfortunately, might be built upon, and some of those may solidify, really changing how we can, who we consider a part of our communities, and how we can kind of relate across divisions of community.
Yeah, that's interesting, Katie. And that was a big tension that surfaced in our forecast 4.0, right? Is in a world that's increasingly personalized, what does it mean to have that level of personalization in community? And I think we're challenging that right now, right? We're seeing how that's playing out. So, in our final, 8 minutes, we were going to end with a question around aspirational futures, but I think we've tackled that one already. So are there any last minute questions you think we should address before we say our goodbyes?
I think, so I think one thing that we just started talking about with community, but just looking at, are there particular things that may be happening outside of education or that we're seeing that are giving us hope? And so it doesn't have to be something we see in learning, or it could be, but is there anything that we can point to that says maybe this shows that we are ready to think differently? about how we respond to this moment and what we do moving forward. I think for me, one thing that is giving me hope is that it does feel as if we don't have to make quite as strong a case for why it's important to think about the future. I think people are more willing to engage in that type of thinking and see it as important. And I think that I don't just say that because that's what we do. I do think that that's really important. If we're going to hope to design something different, we need to be thinking further ahead than our structures and systems in our society often want us to or allow us to, so that people are already asking some really big questions. To me, gives me hope that we can continue that conversation, continue to ask those big questions, continue to challenge ourselves and our colleagues and our leaders to think differently about what we expect from the future, what we need to plan for and prepare for.
Mm-hmm. I also hope that there's a growing recognition too, or a realization that on the other side of this is that change is a constant, right? It's not going to stop. And whether it's disruptive or whether it's continuous change, it's a reality I think that everybody needs to recognize they have to deal with.
Drawing into education a little more specifically, I feel hopeful in seeing the sense of relief that the field has been demonstrating around the easing of standardized testing, the using of those assessments that have been such a hindrance for so long, as well as other strictures, that there's so much that's had to be opened up right now, that I think people are getting some time to live without them. And I think that in combination with our pretty widespread understanding that this is a generational moment, that we need to, since we have to go through it, we need to make the most of it and really think about what we would rather do and not just what we have been doing. If we could come out of this with some way of continuing the breathing room and finding new approaches to assessment and quality assurance, I think that would be very supportive of the kinds of system transformation that a lot of us would like to see.
Yeah. So a little bit closer to education too, it's just like the value or how we value educators and the role that they play in society at large, and not only in learning. I think it's going to be highly appreciated going forward after this crisis. So that's one thing, and I think it even expands, from education. As a society, we're also going to recognize that grocery store clerks and people working in the service industry that are not currently compensated fairly, but have been critical in responding and helping society respond to this crisis, are fundamental, and that we need to appreciate more what they have done and what they are going to continue doing for us. And then at the more abstract and society level, I think just that having this as an example of that contrast between an individualized society and like how this is, a situation in which it's not only about you and your health, but it's actually that you need to take care of yourself for the sake of others. So that is really kind of pushing and challenging some of our most basic Western assumptions as a society. And I'm hopeful that now that we have this as an example, more people are going to be able to understand and relate to this reality and be able to apply that to other instances such as education, and that just because you want what's best for your kid doesn't mean that it's the best for all the kids around them, and that sometimes we would need to make those difficult decisions in order to have everyone kind of go up at the same time and not just that individual.
Yeah, for sure. Before we head out, if it's helpful, we just published a blog series called Futures Thinking Now. So everything we talked about, ranging from uncertainties to assumptions to the futures triangle to vision, there are write-ups fairly short. They're intended to be instructive and illustrate how you might bring some of these tools to bear as you all are faced with making really big decisions in the face of massive uncertainty right now. So if you'd like, please check that out. You can find that at knowledgeworks.org. And then we'll be following up this conversation with some blog posts. The chat and the Q&A was so absolutely rich that we have a lot to write about. So thank you all. And most importantly, thank you for your time and spending it with all of us. If anybody needs anything, if we can be of assistance, please feel free to reach out. You can contact us through the website, knowledgeworks.org. And thank you all.
Yes, thank you.
Be well, everyone.
Yeah, stay safe.